Okay, so welcome to this live webinar on food and migraine. My name is Isabelle O'Carroll. I'm French and a certified nutritionist, an MBA Plus writer of content, and the founder of the Good Days program, which is a specific program on diet. I have been working with the Migraine Buddy team and I've been working with the Migraine Buddy team for 3 years now. So let me start with some good news. Today's live session is sponsored by the Good Days program. We have prepared a surprise for you that we will share at the end of this webinar. So make sure you don't miss it. So today we'll be together for about 1 hour, I guess, with the questions. And first, Chris will join me to share with you some information of science behind migraine, including the migraine threshold and risk factor sensitivity. I will then present on the food risk factors, how to find out your sensitivities and what tools in Migraine Buddy can help you find them. I will also share with you a Good Days program recipe that is available in one of the MBA Plus programs. After that, we will be happy to answer all of your questions. So Chris, are you ready to start now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Isa. So let's start. Let's actually start with the migraine threshold. So for those of you who have not seen the Weather and Migraine webinar yet, and you can watch it anytime on YouTube, I'm Chris from Migraine Buddy. I hold a Master of Science degree, and I also am an MB Plus content writer and a Good Days coach. I'm going to share a bit of science with you tonight, or today, depending on where you are. It is very important in the food context. It will be pretty similar to what you've seen in previous webinars, so please bear with me for a few minutes if you are familiar with what I'm going to say. So to start with, as of today, the causes of migraine remain widely unknown to scientists. We only know that some sensitive brain receptors trigger migraine symptoms when they get upset. They can stand only a certain level of migraine risk. And they get upset when they're exposed to too much of it. The maximum risk level is called the migraine threshold. So when the migraine threshold is reached, brain receptors get upset and migraine symptoms appear. So let's have a look at this on a graph. I love graphs. I hope you guys are okay with this. So risk level is in vertical, with the migraine threshold in red, and horizontal, time is in horizontal, and risk is in orange. So on this graph, we see how the risk level evolves along the day. It decreases slightly from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and then it increases from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. And symptoms appear when the risk reaches the migraine threshold, and this happens between 8 and 9 p.m. So let's dig into this risk in orange, and let's start with risk factors. Risk factors are also known as triggers, but they do not trigger anything. We are exposed to multiple risk factors at once. Each risk factor bears a risk, and they all pile up to form our migraine risk level in orange. And when it reaches the migraine threshold, symptoms appear. They can be related to sleep, to stress, to weather, to hunger, to hydration, to hormones, to exertion, to noises and smells, diet, and others. So let's see how it looks like on our graph. Here is an example of piling risk factors. So we have 4 types of risk related to hormones, weather changes, stress, and added sugar. Note that hormones and weather-related risks remain stable from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Stress slightly decreases, and added sugar risk appears at 4 p.m. and quickly increases from there. Note as well that however we pile them up, symptoms appear at the same time. So for instance, here, I sorted them a different way, another way, and there, a third way, but it doesn't change anything in the end. Symptoms will still appear at the same time, sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. So let's come back to this one. In order to remain free of symptoms, we must stay below the threshold. So quick reminder, sensitive brain receptors trigger migraine symptoms when they get upset. And they get upset when the migraine threshold is reached. How do we stay below the threshold then? There are three ways. The first way is to avoid risk exposure. For instance, if I avoid added sugar at 4 p.m., I stay below the threshold and I don't have symptoms. The second way is to mitigate risk. For example, if I take some time every day to care for my loved ones, 30 minutes to walk my dog, and a few minutes to meditate, over time, I will build resistance to stress. So I will be less affected by stress. On the graph, less risk from stress, so the green band is thinner, and I will stay below the threshold. No symptoms. The only other way to avoid symptoms is to raise the threshold with preventive medication. In this case, brain receptors get less sensitive to migraine risk and can tolerate more risk. So on the graph, the threshold is higher and I have no symptoms. If you have questions on preventive medication and on medication in general, please talk to your doctor. Let's now talk about risk factor sensitivity. So we have high, medium, or low sensitivity to each risk factor we're exposed to. High sensitivity means that when we're exposed, risk rises sharply and quickly reaches the threshold, and symptoms appear. In this case, we are highly sensitive to tannins. In other words, every time we have tea or coffee or chocolate or red apple, we have symptoms. Now, medium sensitivity. Medium sensitivity means that risk level rises significantly, but the threshold is not reached if we are only exposed to this risk factor. But in case of repeated exposure, risk builds up and may finally reach the threshold. And then symptoms appear. If we have low sensitivity, symptoms will not appear when we're only exposed to this risk factor, and even after multiple exposure. But keep in mind that we are also exposed to other risk factors, multiple risks at once, actually. So if our risk level was already high before we had food with tannins, we may end up with symptoms anyway. Okay, so we know that 1, we are exposed to multiple risk factors at once, and 2, we may have high, medium, or low sensitivity to each. In order to stay below the threshold and avoid symptoms, all possible options span from do nothing to control everything. If do nothing worked, we would not be here today. So I exclude this one. control everything is quite restrictive and difficult, very difficult to keep with. On top of this, it is overkilling for each low sensitivity. So ideally, we want to avoid exposure to every high sensitivity risk. We want to mitigate exposure to every medium sensitivity risk. And we don't want to bother about low sensitivity risk. But how can we identify these sensitivities? First, the easy way that doesn't work is called soft test. The idea with the soft test is I don't have symptoms, I get exposed to a risk factor on purpose, then if I get symptoms, it means that I am sensitive to this risk factor. And if I don't get symptoms, it means that I'm not sensitive to it. So intuitively, it sounds logical, but let's see why it doesn't work. First, as long as I don't have symptoms, the only thing that I'm sure that I know, the only thing that I'm sure of, the only thing that I know for sure is that my risk level is below the threshold, but I don't know how far below. So let's take two extreme examples. First, very close to the threshold, and two, very far from the threshold before testing. So in the first case, just before testing, my risk level is already very high. And then I have food with tannins. Symptoms will appear, whatever my sensitivity, whether it's low, medium, or high. I will have symptoms anyway. I was so close to the threshold already. Conclusion, well, I cannot conclude. I cannot say whether I have low, medium, or high sensitivity to tannins. Second case, this time I start very far away from the threshold. So, and then I'm there before testing, and then I have food with tannins. I won't get symptoms if I have low or medium sensitivity. And I will get symptoms if I have high sensitivity. So if I don't have symptoms, I cannot say whether I have low or medium sensitivity. But I know for sure that I am not highly sensitive to tannins. So this is the only thing that I know for sure. So it's better than do nothing, but it's not very helpful in the end. So we won't keep that solution either. The working solution here is what we call test. Keep risk as low as possible. So in this example, I mitigate my sleep disruption, I mitigate stress, and I make sure it is not this time of the month for hormones, and that the weather is fair before testing. And then I test tannins. If symptoms appear, it means that if symptoms appear after short exposure, it means that I have high sensitivity. If symptoms appear after repeated exposure, it means that I have medium sensitivity. And if symptoms do not appear after repeated exposure, it means that I have low sensitivity. So this is very important. This is actually the most important slides. So when testing, if I have symptoms quickly, high exposure. If I have symptoms after repeating the test and not before, if it takes a long time, then it's medium exposure. And if I don't get symptoms after several days of testing, then low exposure. Not low exposure, sorry, low sensitivity. So eliminate every risk factor that you've tested highly sensitive to. mitigate every risk factor that you've tested medium sensitive to, and do not bother about risk factors that you've tested low sensitive to. All right, I hope you guys are still awake. Now, Isa, let's go for the fun part.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. So let me share my screen. Okay. And start on food talk now. So food risk factors and the science behind it. So according to the migraine community, here are the 10 most frequent migraine risk factors. And among those, weather changes and hormones are nearly impossible to control. The remaining 8 are all food and lifestyle risk factors that can be worked on to mitigate the risk of reaching your migraine threshold. So stress and anxiety, sleep disruption, and neck pain are all controllable lifestyle risk factors. It takes time, but by implementing some habits in your daily life, you can take control over them. The other 5 are food and drink related: dehydration, skip meals, alcohol, caffeine, and processed food. Over the last 40 years, research papers on food and migraine have shown that we tend to be sensitive to chemicals contained in food rather than food ingredients. Combining the information from those papers, we pulled out 21 chemicals that are migraine risk factors. So some are chemicals that are added to the food, like for example, in the list known, let's say free glutamate, mainly found in MSG and any fermented food. Also nitrates found in cold cuts, or sulfates in dried foods and wine. Other are chemicals that are a component of the food. So to name a few: capsaicin, which is a hot part of the chili and cayenne pepper; glycoalkaloids found in nightshades and apples; histamine, mainly found in fish, seafood, ground meat, and leftovers; and also salicylate, found in many green vegetables and melons. So note that some foods contain several of those chemicals. For example, a banana contains some histamine and tyramine. So we may think that because we follow a healthy diet, we naturally avoid all food risk factors. This way, we tend to overlook some food chemicals found in the so-called healthy food. For example, salicylates can be found in lots of green vegetables like broccoli, cucumber, and zucchini. Pineapple is a healthy diet favorite that might dramatically raise your risk of having symptoms. Another example is the tomato, with up to 6 chemical risk factors on its own. This shows that healthy food for weight control might not be applicable to migraine. So you may wonder why it is important to identify your food sensitivities. So it's important to identify them to naturally mitigate the risk and control your migraine. Remember what Chris said about the 3 ways to get control over your migraines: avoid risk, mitigate risk, and raise the threshold. So you need to know your sensitivities to avoid or mitigate your food-related risk. So let's see how to get control means then. If you are highly sensitive to a risk factor, then avoid any food that contains these risk factors. If you identify medium sensitivity to a risk factor, then you can control your intake to stay below the threshold. If you identify low sensitivity, then you know you can have as much as you want of this food. So once you know your sensitivities, you can get control. So how to identify your food risk factor sensitivities? So again, as per Chris' demonstration, you know that the best way to find sensitivities is to test. So first, you need to control everything that you can control. Lifestyle protectors to control lifestyle-related risk, and specific diet to control food risk. Then, and only then, because all of your risk factors will be at the lowest level possible, you can start testing food risk factors one by one and evaluate your sensitivity to each of them. So let's now have a look at the available programs to control everything controllable. So let's say the first group of programs is any kind of weight loss programs. Those are great if you want to lose weight, but are not applicable to control migraine food and lifestyle risk factors. As we mentioned before, healthy food can be at risk for migraine sufferers. Migraine doctors programs usually cover half of the risk factors we've discussed today. So if you happen to be sensitive to what they cover and not sensitive to what they do not cover, then they are great for you. But if you want to cover every risk factor we've discussed today, then I would recommend that you try Handy Plus programs. So Migraine Buddy has developed some simple programs with lots of information on both food and lifestyle migraine risk factors. Some will help you recognize the food you should eat with associated recipes and the one you should avoid. But they will also give you tips on how to manage some chemicals just by preparing, cooking, storing your food a certain way. Let's have a look at the quinoa meatballs recipe found in the 10 tips and 5 recipes for a migraine-friendly diet program. Here you can see the layout of the recipe with the ingredients and the step-by-step preparation. In this recipe, we use fresh ground pork and as ground meat. We use fresh ground pork as ground meat develops histamine very quickly. So the fresher you have it, the better. I recommend that you either get the meat from your butcher, making sure he grinds it in front of you. Or you can also get some frozen ground meat that you defrost in the fridge and use as soon as it is defrosted. You can also find in this recipe some shallots that are a good replacement for onions, as it doesn't contain any of the onion's allergens. The herbs are used fresh, as dried products contain sulfates. So each recipe in the programs will give the exact way to use the product and avoid having any migraine risk factor. Those programs will raise your awareness on the food and lifestyle risk factors, and with small steps at a time will help you control all controllable risk factors so that you can get control over time. However, if you prefer a fully dedicated program with a professional coach to get control over your migraines, the Good Days program is for you. It covers all food-related risk factors and even more: stress, sleep, hydration, hunger, neck pain, exertion, and bruxism. Within only 30 days, you will know for sure whether food makes a difference for them. And from then, you'll start testing.